On a chilly March evening in 2015, the quiet suburban community of Riverside, Minnesota, was rocked by a shocking discovery. James Bennett, a 42-year-old local businessman, was found brutally murdered in his own home. Riverside was a town where violent crime was a rarity, making the violent death of a seemingly well-liked and successful man all the more unsettling. Bennett's body was discovered by his wife, Amy, who had returned from a social gathering in the early hours of the morning. What began as a seemingly straightforward investigation quickly spiraled into a complex and disturbing case of hidden obsession and untreated mental illness. James was found lying face down in the living room, his body soaked in blood from multiple stab wounds. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, leading investigators to believe that the killer was someone James had known. Suspicion initially fell on Amy, as is often the case when spouses are involved in sudden and violent deaths. Her behavior was erratic, and neighbors noted that her marriage to James had been strained in recent months. The couple had been living together with Amy's elderly mother, Linda Gray, after the passing of Linda's husband, Peter, a few years earlier. As police began their investigation, they noted that nothing appeared to be stolen, and the house was largely undisturbed except for the violent scene in the living room. It was clear to detectives that this murder was personal. Detective Ellie Johnson, a seasoned investigator with the Riverside Police Department, was assigned to lead the case. Johnson had seen her share of domestic violence cases, and the initial signs pointed toward Amy. But as the layers of the Bennett's troubled marriage began to unravel, a far more disturbing narrative emerged. Amy's alibi for the night of the murder was airtight. She had been at a party with friends and had multiple witnesses who could verify her presence. But her personal life raised eyebrows. Amy had been involved in an affair with a younger man, Jason Williams, a 28-year-old aspiring artist. The affair had been the talk of their small town for months, casting doubt on Amy's innocence. Many believed that the tension between James and Amy over her infidelity could have driven her or Jason to murder, but there were no immediate signs linking Jason to the crime scene. Despite these suspicions, it wasn't Amy's affair that would unravel the truth behind James Bennett's murder. The case would take a shocking turn as detectives began to explore the hidden dynamics of the household, particularly the role of Amy's mother, Linda Gray. As they probed deeper, they unearthed a disturbing fixation that Linda had developed toward James, one that blurred the lines between reality and delusion. As the investigation progressed, Amy Bennett's lover, Jason Williams, became a prime suspect. His relationship with Amy, though emotionally volatile, seemed to be an obvious motive for a crime of passion. Williams was interrogated, his home searched, and his timeline for the night scrutinized. However, he was eventually cleared of suspicion. His whereabouts were accounted for, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene of the crime. Detective Johnson, frustrated by the lack of clear evidence, began to shift her attention back to the Bennett household itself. It was during this period that Linda Gray's unusual behavior began to draw more scrutiny. Linda had been living with James and Amy since her husband's death, and according to friends and neighbors, she had grown increasingly dependent on her daughter and son-in-law. On the surface, Linda appeared to be a grieving widow struggling to adjust to life without her husband. But beneath that exterior, a much darker and more complicated story was emerging. Linda had been diagnosed with schizophrenia in her early 40s, but had been managing her condition with medication for many years. However, after her husband's death, she had gradually begun to neglect her treatment, slipping further into a state of delusion. This deterioration had gone largely unnoticed, or at least unaddressed, by those closest to her. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, but Amy and James had written it off as the emotional strain of grief. It wasn't until Detective Johnson's team searched Linda's room that the full extent of her obsession with James came to light. In a locked drawer in her bedside table, investigators discovered a box of letters addressed to James. The letters, written over the course of several months, detailed Linda's growing infatuation with her son-in-law. In them, she referred to James as the reincarnation of her late husband, Peter, and expressed deep longing for him. Some of the letters took on a disturbingly possessive tone, as Linda fantasized about a life where she and James could be together, free of Amy's presence. At first, the letters seemed more like the ramblings of a mentally unstable woman, but the investigation took a sinister turn when forensic evidence linked Linda to the murder weapon. The knife used to kill James had Linda's fingerprints on it, and fibers from her clothing were found on his body. Faced with this evidence, Linda was brought in for questioning. What followed was a chilling revelation of a woman consumed by delusion, driven to commit an unspeakable act in the belief that she was preserving a twisted vision of her past life. This discovery shifted the entire focus of the investigation. No longer was it a simple case of marital discord and infidelity. It was now a disturbing exploration of a woman whose untreated mental illness had spiraled into a fatal obsession. Detectives began to piece together the events leading up to the night of the murder, looking closely at Linda's mental state and her growing fixation on James. As Detective Ellie Johnson and her team dug deeper into Linda Gray's life, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that had gone largely unnoticed by those around her. The letters found in her room were only part of the evidence that pointed to her escalating obsession with James Bennett. Investigators began interviewing neighbors and family members to understand the dynamics within the Bennett household and how Linda's relationship with James had changed in recent years. According to close friends of the family, Linda had always been overprotective of her daughter, Amy, but her attention had shifted after Peter's death. James had assumed the role of the man of the house, and it seemed that Linda, in her grief and untreated mental state, had transferred her emotional attachment to him. Friends recalled instances where Linda seemed inappropriately affectionate toward James' small, easily overlooked gestures that, at the time, didn't raise alarm. But looking back, these interactions painted a picture of a woman who was becoming more and more detached from reality. Linda's schizophrenia, though previously well controlled, had begun to worsen in the year leading up to the murder. She had stopped taking her medication and refused to see her psychiatrist, insisting that she was no longer ill. Her delusions, which initially seemed harmless, evolved into something far more dangerous as she began to confuse James with her late husband. To Linda, James wasn't just her son-in-law, he was the reincarnation of Peter, the man she had loved for decades. This belief became the foundation for her actions, and she began to see Amy as a rival for James's affection. The final straw seemed to be Amy's affair with Jason Williams. In Linda's mind, Amy's infidelity was an unforgivable betrayal, not only of her marriage to James but also of Linda's vision of their perfect family. As Amy's relationship with Jason grew more public, Linda's letters became more erratic. In one particularly disturbing letter, Linda wrote that she could no longer stand by and watch Amy destroy James, insisting that she had to protect him from her daughter's corruption. To the detectives, this was clear evidence that Linda's motives for the murder were rooted not only in her delusions but also in a deeply personal sense of betrayal and anger. By the time the murder occurred, Linda's mental state had deteriorated to the point where she was no longer able to distinguish between reality and her delusions. On the night of the crime, with Amy out at a party and the house quiet, Linda had acted on the fantasies she had been harboring for months. She waited until James was alone, then retrieved the knife from the kitchen. The brutal nature of the attack suggested that it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Linda had planned this, believing that by killing James she was freeing him from Amy's infidelity and reclaiming him for herself. But even as investigators pieced together this disturbing puzzle, there were still questions to be answered. Why had no one intervened earlier? How had Linda's delusions gone unnoticed for so long, especially by those closest to her? As they continued their investigation, it became clear that the family dynamics within the Bennett household were more dysfunctional than anyone had realized. As the police focused on Linda Gray, the spotlight turned to Amy and her role in the events that led to her husband's murder. Though initially a suspect herself, Amy was quickly cleared of any direct involvement. But her relationship with her mother, as well as her deteriorating marriage to James, revealed a household that had been unraveling long before the fatal night. Amy had been aware of her mother's worsening condition but had chosen to ignore the warning signs. In interviews with detectives, Amy admitted that Linda had become increasingly possessive of James over the past year, often making uncomfortable comments about him and referring to him as if he were her late husband. Amy had dismissed these remarks as the harmless musings of an aging woman struggling with grief. She had never imagined that her mother's fixation could escalate to violence. However, Amy's reluctance to confront Linda's behavior stemmed from more than just denial. In truth, Amy had been overwhelmed by the growing dysfunction in her own life. Her affair with Jason Williams had been a desperate escape from a marriage that had long since lost its passion. While she and James had once been happy, The arrival of Linda in their home had placed an unbearable strain on their relationship. James, though patient at first, had grown increasingly distant as Linda's presence became more intrusive. The couple rarely spent time alone together, with Linda constantly hovering nearby, inserting herself into their conversations and daily routines. So when Amy tried to address the issue with James, he had brushed off her concerns, unwilling to acknowledge the severity of Linda's mental decline. James, too, had been in denial. He was a kind man known for his generosity and patience, but those traits had blinded him to the danger Linda posed. He had believed that by allowing her to stay with them, he was helping her through a difficult time. But in reality, he had unwittingly become the object of her delusions. Amy's affair was both an escape and a cry for help, though it only deepened the cracks in her already fragile marriage. As she drifted further from James, Linda's obsession with him intensified. By the time of the murder, the Bennett household was a pressure cooker of unspoken resentments and unaddressed mental illness. Linda's unchecked schizophrenia, combined with the emotional tension between Amy and James, created a volatile environment that was bound to end in tragedy. Though when confronted by Detective Johnson with the full extent of her mother's actions, Amy was overcome with guilt. She had seen the signs but had been too distracted by her own personal turmoil to take action. To the realization that she had missed the opportunity to prevent her husband's death weighed heavily on her, but there was no turning back. The investigation was now focused solely on Linda and the question of whether her deteriorating mental state would be enough to absolve her of the crime. As the investigation into Linda Gray continued, forensic psychologists were brought in to assess her mental state. The letters she had written to James were central to their analysis, offering a window into the depth of her delusions. Linda's fixation on her son-in-law as a reincarnation of her late husband was a textbook manifestation of her untreated schizophrenia. However, there was a critical question that needed answering. Was Linda fully aware of her actions when she killed James Bennett, or was she acting entirely under the influence of her delusions? The psychologists spent weeks interviewing Linda. Initially, she was calm and composed, insisting that she had never intended to harm James. In her mind, the act of stabbing him had been an expression of love, a way to free him from the clutches of her unfaithful daughter. She described how, in the months leading up to the murder, her dreams of a life with James had become more vivid. She believed that if she could just remove Amy from the equation, everything would fall into place. What made this case so complex was that Linda, while clearly suffering from severe mental illness, demonstrated an alarming level of awareness regarding her actions. She understood that James had been stabbed and that he had died as a result of her actions. More disturbingly, she showed no signs of regret, only a twisted satisfaction in having carried out what she believed was necessary. Linda saw herself as a tragic figure in a love story, rather than a murderer. This blurred the line between delusion and reality, making it difficult for investigators and psychologists alike to determine the extent of her criminal responsibility. In their final report, the forensic psychologists concluded that while Linda's schizophrenia played a significant role in the crime, she had enough awareness of her actions to be considered legally responsible. Her decision to retrieve the knife, wait for the opportune moment when James was alone, and strike with calculated precision all pointed to premeditation. Linda's delusions had influenced her motives, but she had consciously acted on those delusions with lethal intent. This meant that, despite her mental illness, she would be held accountable for James Bennett's death. As these findings came to light, prosecutors prepared to charge Linda with second-degree murder, a crime that carried a significant prison sentence but took into account her mental condition. The trial would be a complex one, requiring the jury to understand the fine line between madness and malice. Meanwhile, Amy Bennett faced the aftermath of her mother's crime and the shattering of her own life. In April 2016, the trial of Linda Gray began, drawing significant media attention. The public was fascinated by the disturbing details of the case, a mother-in-law driven to murder by an obsession with her son-in-law, who she believed was the reincarnation of her late husband. It was the kind of tragedy that felt ripped from the pages of a Gothic novel, but it was all too real for the people of Riverside. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically. They argued that while Linda was clearly suffering from a severe mental illness, she had acted with premeditation and intent. They pointed to the letters as evidence of her long-standing fixation on James and her growing animosity toward Amy. The prosecution described how Linda had viewed Amy's affair as the final betrayal and had taken matters into her own hands to protect James, as twisted as that idea might seem. They also focused heavily on the physical evidence. The knife used in the murder was covered in Linda's fingerprints, and fibers from her clothing were found on James's body, further tying her to the crime. The fact that there had been no signs of forced entry and that James had been attacked while alone in his home only strengthened the argument that this was a premeditated murder committed by someone with intimate access to the household. On the other side, Linda's defense attorney faced the difficult task of balancing her mental illness against the undeniable facts of the case. The defense acknowledged that Linda had killed James, but argued that her schizophrenia had rendered her incapable of fully understanding the consequences of her actions. They claimed that Linda had been living in a delusional state for months, driven by the belief that she was acting out of love, not malice. To support their argument, the defense brought in a series of mental health experts who testified to the severity of Linda's condition. They described how her untreated schizophrenia had warped her perception of reality, leading her to confuse James with her late husband and to view Amy as a threat to her delusional relationship. These experts emphasized that Linda's actions were not driven by rational thought, but by a profound mental break from reality. The courtroom became a battleground between the prosecution and the defense, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. The jury was tasked with deciding whether Linda Gray was guilty of murder, or whether her mental illness excused her from full responsibility. Adding to the complexity was the emotional toll on Amy, who had to testify about her mother's behavior in the months leading up to the murder. Amy's testimony was one of the most difficult moments of the trial. She described the gradual unraveling of her mother's mental state, the strange comments, the possessive behavior toward James. Amy admitted that she had failed to intervene, consumed by her own problems, and this admission only deepened her guilt. But what left the courtroom in stunned silence was when Amy revealed that, despite everything, she still loved her mother. She had lost both her husband and, in a sense, her mother to this tragedy. As the trial drew to a close, the jury faced an agonizing decision. They had to weigh Linda's mental illness against the calculated nature of the crime. The authorship win. In the end, they delivered a verdict that balanced both aspects of the case. Linda Gray was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury acknowledged her schizophrenia, but concluded that it did not absolve her of responsibility for James Bennett's death. In the weeks following the verdict, the court turned its attention to sentencing. Given the complex nature of the case, the judge had to consider both the need for justice and the importance of addressing Linda's mental illness. The prosecution pushed for a significant prison sentence, arguing that Linda's actions had been deliberate and that she posed a danger to those around her, particularly given her refusal to seek treatment in the months leading up to the murder. The defense, on the other hand, urged the court to show leniency, emphasizing that Linda's schizophrenia had played a central role in the crime. They argued that her condition could be managed with proper psychiatric care and that she was not a violent person outside of her delusional state. They asked for a sentence that would focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment, pointing to Linda's long history of managing her illness before she had stopped taking her medication. After careful deliberation, the judge handed down a sentence that sought to balance these concerns. Linda Gray was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. However, the sentence came with the stipulation that Linda would receive mandatory psychiatric treatment throughout her incarceration. The judge acknowledged the severity of her mental illness, but made it clear that her actions had caused irreparable harm. The sentence was meant to ensure that Linda would never again be in a position to harm anyone, while also addressing the root cause of her crime. For the Bennett family, the sentencing marked the end of a long and painful ordeal. Amy Bennett, now left to rebuild her life, had lost everything: her husband, her mother, and her sense of security. The town of Riverside, once a quiet and unassuming place, had been forever changed by the tragedy that unfolded in one of its suburban homes. But even with Linda behind bars, the case raised broader questions about mental health, family dynamics, and the often overlooked warning signs of psychological decline. Linda Gray had been a ticking time bomb, her untreated illness turning her into a danger to those she loved. The case became a chilling reminder of what can happen when mental illness goes unaddressed and unchecked. As Linda Gray settled into her prison sentence, Riverside struggled to come to terms with the tragedy that had shattered the Bennett family. The town's quiet streets, once known for their safety and sense of community, were now shadowed by the memory of James Bennett's brutal death. The case lingered in the public's consciousness, a reminder of how easily things can spiral out of control when mental illness and personal obsession collide. For Amy Bennett, the months following the trial were a period of profound grief and introspection. She had lost both her husband and her mother in the most unimaginable way, and though she was technically free of the chaos that had ruled her life for so long, the emotional weight of it all was suffocating. Amy moved out of the Riverside home she had shared with James, unable to bear the memories etched into every corner of the house. She sought counseling to deal with the immense guilt she carried, guilt for not seeing the signs of her mother's descent, guilt for her affair, and guilt for not being able to save James from her mother's deadly fixation. But even as she worked through her grief, Amy was determined to turn her pain into something meaningful. In the years following the trial, she became an advocate for mental health awareness, particularly for the families of those suffering from schizophrenia and other severe mental illnesses. She spoke publicly about her experiences, using her story to shed light on the dangers of untreated mental illness and the importance of early intervention. Amy's advocacy gave her a sense of purpose, a way to make sense of the senseless tragedy that had taken everything from her. The story of James Bennett's murder and the subsequent trial of Linda Gray also left an indelible mark on the criminal justice system in Minnesota. The case highlighted the complexities of dealing with defendants who suffer from severe mental illness, raising questions about how the legal system handles such individuals. The Linda sentence, while seen as just by some, sparked debate over whether the prison system was truly equipped to manage inmates with serious psychiatric conditions. The case led to renewed calls for reforms in the way mentally ill offenders were treated, pushing for better mental health care both inside and outside of prison. Linda Gray, now several years into her 25-year sentence, had become a shadow of the woman she once was. Though she received psychiatric treatment in prison, her delusions persisted, albeit with less intensity. In her mind, the lines between her past life with Peter and her present reality remained blurred. She continued to believe that her actions had been justified, that she had been protecting James from the sins of those around him. Linda's refusal to fully accept the consequences of her actions left her isolated, even within the prison walls. The mandatory psychiatric care had stabilized her condition to some extent, but the damage was irreversible. Linda's schizophrenia, left untreated for too long, had warped her perception of the world beyond repair. Her prison life was marked by long stretches of silence and solitary reflection. Though she interacted with other inmates, she was often lost in her own thoughts, still clinging to the delusions that had driven her to commit murder. As the years passed, Linda's chances for parole dwindled. Her refusal to express true remorse for her crime, combined with her continued belief in the righteousness of her actions, made her a poor candidate for early release. It became clear that Linda would likely spend the rest of her life in prison, a tragic figure whose mental illness had led her down a dark and irreversible path. The murder of James Bennett was more than just a shocking crime. It was a case study in the consequences of neglecting mental health, both on an individual and societal level. Linda Gray's story was a tragic example of how untreated schizophrenia, combined with the emotional turmoil of loss, could evolve into a dangerous obsession that ultimately led to murder. But it was also a story about the complexities of family, of how love and obligation can blind people to the warning signs of disaster. In the years following the trial, Riverside slowly returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of the crime remained. The case had shaken the town, forcing its residents to confront uncomfortable truths about mental illness and the limits of their own understanding. Families who had once been content to keep their struggles private began seeking help, spurred by the cautionary tale of the Bennett family. Mental health services in the area saw an increase in demand as more people came forward to address issues they had previously ignored. For Amy Bennett, life would never be the same. But in the midst of her personal tragedy, she had found a way to honor James's memory by becoming a voice for those whose loved ones were suffering in silence. Her advocacy work, though rooted in pain, became a source of healing for herself and others. She traveled across the state, speaking at mental health conferences and community gatherings, urging people to pay attention to the signs of mental illness in the loved ones and to seek help before it was too late. James Bennett's death, while senseless and cruel, had not been in vain. It sparked conversations about mental health, justice, and the importance of understanding the minds of those we care about. In the end, his legacy was not defined by the way he died, but by the changes his death had inspired. Amy's message was clear: we must be vigilant, compassionate, and proactive when it comes to mental health, because the cost of ignoring it can be deadly. The Bennett case, though closed, would serve as a lasting reminder of what can happen when obsession, denial, and untreated mental illness intersect in the most tragic of ways.